Well, good morning. Well, I suspect it's morning. It's warm. It's morning where I am, and any points west of me will certainly be in the AM. So, welcome to another webinar presented through eKonomics. We hope that those of you who've had an opportunity to attend a couple of these sessions have been enjoying the content. Like I was telling the host for this meeting this morning, this one's going to be a little bit more challenging. Um, just not just because that happens to be in the title. This one's going to be fairly science heavy, so there's going to be a lot of data presented. My goal is to present it in such a way that it's still meaningful for you as a someone who may be more applied, maybe a little bit closer to the farmer. Just trying to give you some clarity on the challenges associated with managing phosphorus. This is not going to be exhaustive, and the approach that I'm going to take is maybe going to be a little bit different because I want to sort of present this information with the context of the challenges that we face in the Western Lake Erie Basin and some of the things that we've learned. All the data is not going to be from the Western Lake Erie Basin. A lot of it will be, but I will be pulling data from other Western locales, Iowa, Illinois, Kansas. Those are the three that come right off the top of my head, where there are other scientists and researchers doing investigation on how do we best manage phosphorus fertilizer input into a crop production system to minimize its risk of transport. So that's going to be the focus for today. We've got an hour to fill. There will be a QR code presented at the conclusion of the session for you to capture your CEUs for those who are joining us live. For those of you hearing this as a recording, there will be a quiz that will be associated with the conclusion of this that you'll have to take in order to get your credits. But hopefully you'll find this information of value. For those of you who haven't, what I call, fought the wars of the Western Lake Erie Basin over the last decade and a half, maybe this isn't something you've thought too much about or really delved into the science too much at all. So this may be a little bit of a different presentation, but I definitely think there's something that you can take back with you in the execution of your job as you're communicating with farmers and how best to manage phosphorus to deal with two different types of transport materials and how disparate they are in the way, what the ideal way to manage them is. So the title of this is The Challenge of Managing Phosphorus Transport. It's definitely not simple, and I could not stress that enough. It's definitely not simple. So let's get rolling. Any talk dealing with phosphorus loss specifically, you really have to talk about the different transport mechanisms. We're not going to get into the physics of this. This is going to be fairly high level, but what we're going to be talking about is when we're talking about transport mechanism, what talking about? Are we talking about erosion? Are we talking about leaching? And if we're talking about erosion, are we talking about particulate phosphorus transport? Are we talking about water soluble phosphorus transport, dissolved reactive phosphorus transport? Those two terms, water soluble and dissolved reactive, can be used interchangeably. How do we understand those transport mechanisms and what actually leads to particulate phosphorus transport? What sort of production practices? What sort of production practices leads to soluble phosphorus transport? When do I need to be worried about leaching of phosphorus? Again, it's not going to be an exhaustive conversation on that subject, but it's just going to be introductory and give us a jumping off point as we get into some of the other conversation about how do we manage that. And that's ultimately where we're going to be concluding this conversation. And then transport trends. What have we noticed in the case study that I'm presenting, which is the Western Lake Erie Basin? What have we observed with regard to total phosphorus over some longer time scale? What have we noticed about soluble phosphorus? What sort of inferences can we draw about what we're observing in the aquatic system? What's going into Maumee River? Can we make any inferences about what's going on the landscape that provides water into that watershed, of what may be contributing to what we're seeing? And again, a lot of these conversations were had about a decade and a half ago, and I still feel like there's still some unanswered questions that we really don't have true clarity on, and I'm not sure that we ever will. But that's a whole different conversation. But just give you an understanding of how the mechanics and then what the trends are with regard to what we're seeing, and then continuing on with that case study, just to give you a little bit more clear optic on what's going on. What other pieces of information do we have access to tell us about what has changed in the Western Lake Erie Basin? Some things that are a little bit more definitive, some things that we think we understand that have occurred, and then trying to make some linkages with what's changing and what the transport trends look like. And then what are others learning? What sort of management tools do we have in the toolbox for us to more effectively keep phosphorus in our agricultural fields um, moving forward? What are some of the challenges associated with some of the production practices that are being promoted as potential solutions? And I'm using my air quotes because I'm not sure that some of them are clearly solutions. They are for one thing, but they're not for the other. And that's part of the challenge of managing phosphorus. And my hope is at the end of this, you'll see that with a little bit more clarity than what you came in with. At least that's the desire. So transport mechanisms, this is, again, a fairly broad introduction. I'm not going to dive into any of the details associated with this, but just in general, I stole this from somebody. I'm not really sure who I stole this from. I'm sure it was a book, and shame on me for not providing you the clear reference. I generally do. You'll notice throughout this, everything else is referenced, but for some reason I did not reference this one. But the general concept is I'm trying to produce a crop, right? And the goal of any crop production system is to increase the amount of grain that's being harvested from that production setting. And one of the ways that we can promote increased grain productivity is through fertilization, right? And if you notice, out the length of this entire discussion, this entire presentation, I don't necessarily distinguish fertilizer from manure. To me, fertilizer encompasses all of it. Now there's some different challenges associated with their management, but when I say fertilizer, don't instantly think commercial fertilizer, because I don't. When I say fertilizer, I'm thinking of commercial fertilizer. I'm thinking of chicken litter. I'm thinking of hog effluent. I'm thinking of dry solids from a beef lot, right? That to me is all fertilizer, and they all should be managed in such a way to minimize loss. So don't just automatically assume commercial fertilizer. So in our desire to increase grain, we're going to supply some form of fertilizer, whether it's coming from an animal or coming out of a bag. And when we supply that material, guess what? 75% of the phosphorus that you supply is retained in that soil. I think that's a fairly low estimate, to be honest with you. There was a study published. It was one of the graduate students at Oklahoma State University who was a master's student with me way back in the late 90s. That's a sad statement. And we had a long-term experiment there at Oklahoma State that was established in 1892. Yeah, that's a long time to be doing field research. And they actually went in and did a characterization, a speciation of all of the phosphorus contained within that experiment. And in the commercial fertilizer, this is one of the few times I'll be very specific, in the commercial fertilizer treatment. Now, admittedly, those didn't start to come online until the late 30s and 40s, right? Because prior to that, our only source of fertilizer was animal manure. But where we were using commercial fertilizer, they could account for like 80+% of all the phosphorus that had ever been supplied into that system. So the amount of phosphorus that was being lost was fairly small. So this 75% may be a little bit of a low estimate, but it gets us in the ballpark. So the bulk of the phosphorus that you're going to supply is going to be retained in that soil. A large percentage of it is also going to wind up in the harvested crop. We could talk about efficiency of phosphorus from an annual perspective, and it's not terribly efficient, but long-term it's fairly efficient. And then the rest of it is subjected to loss, right? We have runoff. And the only thing I want to say about runoff is runoff occurs when the rate of precipitation exceeds the infiltration rate of the soil, and we get water moving along that soil surface. There are certain things that we can do to manage that, right? So we can maintain surface residue. It doesn't necessarily change the volume of water that's lost, but it certainly changes what particles are being carried away with that water as it leaves the field. Okay, and I'll show you some data on that a little bit later when we start talking about cover crops. So don't always assume that because it's a no-till system that I dramatically decrease the amount of water that's lost. You can affect infiltration rate, but it's not going to be all that dramatic. And sometimes I think we subscribe to this concept that no-till fields don't experience runoff. Well, the data doesn't substantiate that. But again, the nature of that runoff material is dramatically different. The water is clearer, but does clear water necessarily mean clean water? That's going to be part of the conversation as we move forward. And then so about 5% is by runoff. And I think that's probably a little bit of a high estimate from my own experience. But again, it gets us ballpark. At least it gives us a jumping off point. Then I've got phosphorus leaching, right? And the amount of phosphorus that's lost via leaching is relatively small, less than 1%. It's different for different production systems. We're not going to dive into that today, because I have to start talking about things like matrix flow, macropores, shunting of water at the surface to some sort of an artificial drainage system below the soil surface that can carry more phosphorus away. We're not going to get into that today. That's not the nature of this conversation. We're primarily going to be focused on this runoff fraction. And all I really want you to take from this is a couple of different things. And that is this concept of bioavailability. So just because I'm losing phosphorus into a water body doesn't necessarily mean that all of it that's being lost is in a form that is ultimately usable by some biological entity in that water that could result in things like increased algal growth, right? The bioavailable fraction is really the fraction that is the fraction of the greatest concern. So if we're talking about sediment-bound phosphorus, or particulate P is another way that we would call that, particulate phosphorus. So this is phosphorus that's bound to some sort of a clay material, which is, again, if you're in conventional tillage agriculture, which I don't really know what conventional till agriculture is anymore, it's certainly not going to be a moldboard plow. We still have folks that moldboard plow, but I would not say that that's a large percentage of the agricultural production in the United States that still employs that tillage practice. But if you're in that sort of a system where you're clean tilling, you have very little residue, the water that's coming off that field is going to contain a considerable amount of solids in the form of clay material. And with that clay material is phosphorus is being transported. The good news, clay itself or soil itself, now it's called sediment when it's in solution, represents its own problems. And we're not going to talk about dredging of areas that become, we start having draft issues on rivers because the sediment is accumulating at the bottom. Now we have to go in and dredge that material out so we can allow certain types of conveyance systems to still occur. But the good news with sediment-bound phosphorus is that a large fraction of the phosphorus that's bound to that clay is not going to be desorbed. It is a little bit of a function of the nature of the clay, whether it's aluminum or an iron. Iron is going to be a little bit more willing to give it up because it has redox potential. Again, we're not going to dive into that chemistry, but just recognize particulate-bound phosphorus is not 100% bioavailable the day it hits a water body. We tend to assume it's about 30%. Now, that's not going to be perfect for all clays, but it just gives us a jumping off point. Again, it's not 100%. The problem with any phosphorus that's in a water extractable, dissolved reactive, water soluble, all of those terms can be used interchangeably. They're presented in different publications in the scientific literature. That stuff is 100% bioavailable. So that's in a form that a plant that exists in an aquatic ecosystem can utilize and use it for its biomass production and growth. So of these two, which one is of greatest ecological importance? Well, it's going to be the soluble reactive, dissolved reactive, water soluble, water extractable. I keep using those different terms so that you're comfortable with seeing them or hearing them. This one is of quite a bit of concern because as soon as this hits a water body, it can be utilized by a biological entity. This one, not so much. But again, the particulate P has its own concerns beyond the phosphorus side, and we can't minimize those. So just really quickly, again, I'm not going to dive into the chemistry of this. Just understand that as you load a soil with P, so as you continue to load phosphorus into the soil, you're going to reach a point where you can no longer add more. Well, you can, but what happens is the amount of dissolved P, or the P that's in a form that is ultimately bioavailable, will ramp up pretty dramatically. Okay, and we can actually do soil analysis to determine this for various soils. The only thing that I do want to point out is that for most of our agronomic recommendations, we should be on the very far left of this scale. Now, there are times, and I'm not throwing animal production systems under the bus. It's just a reality. But if I have a soil that has a history of receiving large quantities of animal manure, you're going to be further out here along this P loading x-axis, and you're going to be approaching your absorption maxima. Your dissolved P concentration is going to be fairly high. You can see leaching in those systems of phosphorus. But for most of our agronomic recommendations, we're going to be way back here on the low side of the scale. Okay. And again, I apologize for the technological glitch. The one nice thing about phosphorus, and we talk about this a lot if you've taken any sort of a soil science course, it's not terribly mobile within the soil system. We know that. There are exceptions, right? No-till is the clearest one, and it has to do with preferential flow or macro pore flow, shunting, or connectivity between the soil surface and some sort of an artificial drainage structure below the soil surface. You can actually get, and we've done these experiments, or I haven't, but scientists have done these experiments where if I put some sort of fertilizer source on the soil surface in a no-till system, and I've got these macro pores, specifically if it's a little bit dry, if I have a macro pore channel that connects the soil surface to the subsurface tile, boom, I can get almost immediate loss of phosphorus via leaching. But again, we're not going to spend a whole lot of time with that particular mechanism. If phosphorus is moving through the soil in what we call matrix flow, which means it's going to be interacting with that soil as it moves deeper through that soil profile, phosphorus just isn't going to move very much, which is good and bad. It's bad from maybe from a productivity perspective and ensuring that we have an adequate supply to the plant, but it's good in that the loss potential is relatively low. So the primary ways that phosphorus leaves the field are going to be erosion, which we've talked about, surface runoff, which is related to erosion. Soil erosion is the process of transporting soil away from the field into some sort of a surface drainage feature. Runoff is just anytime water precipitation rate exceeds infiltration and I have water moving across the soil surface. Similar mechanism, but surface runoff doesn't necessarily mean that erosion is occurring. Leaching is, again, really only an issue if we're talking about no-till production systems or soils that are really high in phosphorus. And again, we're not going to focus on that particular fraction today. We're primarily going to be talking about runoff loss potential and how to manage it. So what are we seeing in the Western Lake Erie Basin? And part of the reason I provide this is just to provide some context for what's going on and maybe what you're also seeing in other geographies beyond Western Lake Erie Basin. This is just a really good case study of us trying to figure out what's going on at the macro scale and how that's influencing what our recommendations are for farmers at a micro scale for how to best manage their phosphorus inputs to minimize transport risk. So for those of you who aren't familiar with Western Lake Erie Basin geography, primarily we're focused on 3 rivers, right? We know that there's others that feed into this, but we're primarily focused on the Maumee, the Portage, and the Sandusky. Those are all in the state of Ohio. If you sort of draw a line right about here is going to be the Michigan-Ohio line. And we're not going to talk about the specific numbers, but the bulk of this basin, in at least the northwestern part of Ohio, is primarily characterized by production agriculture. That's what we call our black swamp area, fairly poorly drained soils. Almost all of them require some sort of a tile drainage feature in order to help their level of productivity. Otherwise, they just lay very, very wet and are not terribly productive. We could talk a lot about the intensity of the drainage pattern and how they've decreased the spacing between those lateral lines. We see this annually. Every year, someone's upgrading their tile drainage system, and the spacing between those laterals gets tighter and tighter and tighter. So this is where we are, just geographically orient you. Here's the counties that we're talking about. And again, more than anything, this is just to get you sort of calibrated to where I'm talking about when I talk about Western Lake Erie Basin. So what have we seen? So this is some larger scale trends from 1967 to 2013. The only reason I don't report newer data is because it hasn't been published to my knowledge. I'm a data hound. The more data that I have available to me, the more that I will present to you as the audience. But what you notice is starting in the late 60s, this is total phosphorus load in metric tons per year per annum. And the International Joint Commission, the IJC, established in the early 70s a target of, we want to hit total phosphorus below 11,000 metric tons per calendar year. That's what their goal was. There's a couple different things that they did to try to achieve that goal. One of the ones was they banned phosphorus containing detergents because if you're familiar at all with cleaning solutions, phosphates are really good in cleaning solutions. They do a really good job of extracting blood, extracting mud, extracting things, or even cleaning dishes. Phosphates are really good at that. The problem is, you can imagine what's coming out of the end of the pipe when phosphates are going into these water treatment facilities. High concentration of phosphorus. The technology that we had employed at the time for wastewater treatment facilities wasn't what it is today. There's a conversation there that we're not going to touch about the age of some of these existing wastewater treatment facilities. Um, but all you need to recognize is that from the late 60s into the mid 90s, boy, it seemed like we really had a handle on this. The frequency, I'm just going to arbitrarily pick a timeline. I hate when people do that, and here I am doing it. If you say post 1990, how many times did we exceed that 11,000 uh, metric tons per annum of total phosphorus going into the Western Lake Erie Basin? Well, let's see. We're not going to count that one because that's below. 1, 2, 3 times from 1990 to 2013 did we exceed the 11,000 metric tons per calendar year. So you'd be like, hey, yes, we've solved the problem. Well, if you look at what's occurring in Western Lake Erie Basin, about in the, let's say the late 90s, early 2000s, we started noticing that the Western Lake Erie Basin was being characterized by a fairly consistent algal algal bloom or algal outbreak that was not really jiving with this data that's saying, hey, we've solved the problem. We're decreasing the amount of phosphorus that's going into Western Lake Erie Basin. Mitigation techniques have worked, and we do not need to do anything any further. Well, that's actually not what happened. We started seeing this algal bloom start to even change the nature of it, which again, that's not the point of this conversation. But it starts begging the question, well, if the total phosphorus concentration has been decreasing over time and we're hitting the targets that were established by this International Joint Commission in the 70s, what in the world is going on today? What is the nature of the phosphorus that's moving into that Western Lake Erie Basin? So we dive into some of the data and we start looking at the annual loading from specific water bodies. And the cool thing about Ohio is it's a line item budget that occurs at the state level that funds the analysis and monitoring of water quality in specific river systems that represent different watersheds. So from 1975 to 2018, this is the annual loading of total phosphorus. So total phosphorus loads from 75 to 18, and it's fairly flat. So even though you go back to this previous one, hey, we were dramatically decreasing it, the Maumee River system was pretty much flat over that same time period. So you might think, well, is that a major contributor? Again, that's a whole different conversation, but total phosphorus loads are fairly flat. This is just differentiating between the spring and the fall loading. So spring total load across that same time period, fairly flat. You could maybe even argue a slight decline, specifically if I'm pointing back to the late 70s. And then we go to the annual loading of dissolved reactive phosphorus. So I've just translated from total phosphorus. I'm going to skip over the spring, and now we're talking about dissolved reactive phosphorus, water extractable phosphorus. The one that is of greater concern because of its high bioavailability. And what do you notice? Over that same time scale, where total P contribution to Western Lake Erie Basin is fairly flat, dissolved reactive phosphorus seems to be on the incline. And what I've often said is even if it's not technically increasing, we certainly see an increased frequency of large dissolved reactive loads moving into the Western Lake Erie Basin. And then it begs the question, is this what is driving what we're observing with regard to the algal blooms? And if it is, what is the mitigation techniques that we should be employing in the agricultural sector to deal with this issue? Because this one's fairly easy to address, right? If we're just worried about total phosphorus, and let me be more specific, if I'm just worried about particulate phosphorus, we all know what mitigation technique we can deploy to minimize the risk of sediment-bound transport of phosphorus, and that is decreased tillage frequency, decreased tillage intensity. So adopt something that's more conservation till, going to maintain more residue, going to decrease the ability of an individual rainfall particle to impact the soil, dislodge some of the clay material, and move that material across the soil surface. And the best way to do that is some sort of a residue or a crop cover, okay, or a plant cover. but this one is maybe a little bit different. And this is what we're going to be speaking to for the remainder of this presentation. And just to show you, interestingly enough, that it's not necessarily coming from the spring loading of that dissolved reactive fraction. It's most likely coming from increase in the fall loading. And if you're familiar with Midwestern agriculture and the way we traditionally manage nutrient inputs, fall is really a preferred time to make those applications. Now, don't misunderstand. I don't want this misrepresented to you as an audience member. This is not to say that fall application is the problem. It might be a contributor, but I think the bigger issue is the way we're managing the phosphorus input into this system and how that contributes to phosphorus transport over the fall season. Again, I'll provide more clarity on this as we proceed through the presentation. So just to show you again what's changed over time, this is annual DRP as a percentage of total phosphorus. So if you think about total phosphorus is going to be a combination of particulate bound phosphorus, sediment bound phosphorus, and dissolved reactive phosphorus. So what fraction of total P is now represented by DRP over time? And again, what you notice is as you get into the late 90s, early 2000s, the percentage of DRP that is represented in the total P value is increasing. So again, that sort of leads back to this similar scenario of, boy, our total P really doesn't change all that much, but we're seeing a greater amount of dissolved reactive phosphorus that's being transported into the Western Lake Erie Basin. Is this what's driving the algal blooms that we're seeing in the spring, late spring, early summer? Well, really more midsummer. And again, this is just another data source as opposed to the Maumee. I'm going to be talking about the Sandusky. So that was one closer to the middle part of Ohio that borders Lake Erie. We've got bioavailable particulate P. So this is a very specific fraction of particulate P that's now being measured as the bioavailable fraction. And then I've got bioavailable dissolved P, which would just be dissolved P. And if you notice, as you move through the 90s in this characterization, the biggest driver was bioavailable particulate P. And then as you move into the 90s, late 90s into the 2000s, now the bioavailable dissolved P is becoming the form that is of greatest concern for us. And again, it starts to beg the question, what is driving this? And then what do we do as agricultural managers to help mitigate some of this risk of transport of this particular dissolved reactive phosphorus fraction? Just another illustration, Sandusky River. If you notice that from the mid 80s to the early 2000s, it's an increasing line, right? But the slope is fairly flat. And you notice there was sort of a step change event. Not really sure if I can point my finger to exactly what happened, but from 2002 on, the rate of increase of dissolved reactive phosphorus moving into the Sandusky River is increasing. So the rate has changed. It was always climbing, but now it's climbing at a faster rate. And then just bloom severity, and I actually could provide this for 2020. 2020 was a really low bloom severity. I think we were like a 3.5, if memory serves. You'd think I'd know that as many times as I look at these things. It's not just a number that I had committed to memory, but it was a really low bloom severity for 2020. We could try to assess why that was. We're gonna avoid doing that for this presentation because that's a whole different data set that I'd have to present. So what else is going on? So we see these trends in water phosphorus in the Western Lake Erie Basin. So what's going on the landscape that maybe we could maybe point to that would describe what's actually occurring? And again, I'm going to bring this all back together for why this matters for those of you who don't reside in Ohio. So what's been going on? Total P transport really hasn't changed all that much, but we've seen an uptake in dissolved reactive phosphorus, especially away from spring. So why? What's going on? And when we first started this analysis, we're using more fertilizer. Well, we have access to FarmGate sales information through APCO. We can actually look at trends of fertilizer consumption. Now, this is for the state of Ohio. I didn't break this out by county. This is just the entirety of the state. But in the late 70s, early 80s, we were somewhere around 300,000 tons of phosphate being consumed. And today we're about half that. So it's not just that we're supplying more phosphorus fertilizer, because the data doesn't bear that out. In fact, the data bears out that we're consuming dramatically less phosphorus fertilizer than we had 3 to 4 decades ago. Well, then there's people, well, we have more animals. Well, that's not necessarily true. It is true for our hog inventories, but for our cattle inventories, they have decreased rather dramatically as well. Now, you could point to, well, there's increased CAFOs, right? We have fewer animals, but they're much more concentrated in smaller geographic regions, and as a result, they represent a greater threat to water quality because of the manure that's being produced. That could be a valid argument. And again, I'm not trying to throw those individuals involved in animal agriculture that rely upon this material as a fertilizer source, I'm not throwing them under the bus. It's just the reality of the production environment that we are faced with today. So could that be a contributing factor? Yeah, that could be. And from a regulatory, and even, in the state of Ohio, we actually have legislation that deals with fertilizer use, specifically phosphate containing fertilizers. That would represent a dramatically different solution than if we think this is a broader problem. I think this would be actually easier to deal with. Is it a contributing factor? Yes. Is it the driving factor? I don't suspect so. I don't know that, but that's just my suspicions based upon some additional knowledge that I have about how this manure is being utilized, and some of the BMPs that are in place to at least mitigate some of the risk of transport of the phosphorus that's contained in this manure fertilizer when it's being utilized. So it's not just fertilizer consumption is increased. It's not that we have more animals that are being produced. There's something else that's going on. And then we start looking at things like this, and this is from Elizabeth Dayton, who's a scientist at Ohio State University. I was involved in this project early on when I was still an academic back in the early 2000s, late 2000s, 2008, 2009, 2010. And you look at things like fertilizer inputs on a county scale. Then you look at fertilizer or crop outputs or nutrient removal within that same geography. And you start looking at, well, what are the trends? And what you notice is, and there's been a couple of different publications, I'm a co-author on a couple of these, where the actual amount of material being removed in a harvest is exceeding what's being supplied by fertilization. And that accounts for manure as well. It's not just commercial fertilizer. And we see these rather dramatic deficits in phosphorus. So it's just illustrating, it's sort of supporting this data that says, yeah, it's not that we're dramatically oversupplying phosphorus. So still, what's driving this? What is actually leading to this increased algal bloom severity that we observe in the Western Lake Erie Basin? There's another piece of information we start looking, and that is soil testing trends. Anything that's going to be this light pinkish, I don't know what other color that would be. It's sort of between an orange and a red for my eye, means that there's a decreasing trend. That means that the overall trend is decreasing soil test phosphorus value. And if you look at the northwestern part of Ohio, it's characterized by a decreasing trend, which is matching this data as well, which matches this data as well. So again, it's not just over fertilization. Now, again, I'm not going to argue that there is not areas within these smaller geographies that experience dramatic over fertilization, whether that comes from a manure source or even from a commercial fertilizer source. I suspect that does occur, but it's not broadly occurring. So again, what is actually going on in the northwest part of the state that's driving this dissolved reactive phosphorus increase? Because it's not just gross over fertilization, at least on a macro level. Is it tillage? Is it because we have more conservation tillage in that particular geography? And this was a publication of Jarvie in 2017 that looked specifically at the Western Lake Erie Basin. They added another a river system. They added the Raisin. If I went back to that previous slide, I could point it out to you. It's not important. All that you really need to recognize is that the percentage of high residue management systems. So if you look back to the early 80s, pretty invasive tillage regimes that were being employed at the time. And as you move forward in time, you think about the first no-till drill, which was the late 80s, which really helped us with like things like cropping soybeans into heavy corn residue. And that promoted the adoption of no-till management strategies. And now we're up here where very high percentage of farms in the northwest part of the state in that Western Lake Erie Basin that are utilizing high residue management systems. Now, let's not be confused by this, because it's not just as simple as that. So traditionally in the state of Ohio, we have a rotational tillage production system. So we're primarily going to be tilling after the beans prior to going into the corn, and the beans are going to be no-tilled in. So I wonder about this characterization. Is this really accurate? Because and it also depends on what they consider high residue. I'd have to dig back into that publication and see what that was. The tip, and I know I'm gonna screw this number up, but I'm gonna try to report it anyway. I think by NRCS standards, any crop production system that maintains 50% residue cover is considered no-till or something equivalent to it. Okay, so even if this is this may not all be no-till, right? This may be some sort of a conservation tillage system that's trying to maintain more residue. And that's great, because that's certainly going to help us with getting a little bit more carbon into our soils. It's going to help us with decreasing the potential for particulate P transport, but it doesn't necessarily help us with dissolved reactive phosphorus. That may not be clear at this point, but it will be here in a moment. And again, so this is the percentage of the change in residue management, and this is the cumulative watershed P balance. And again, they're showing you the same information that I've showed you in the 3 previous slides. The amount of phosphorus that we're removing from these fields exceeds what's being put into the production system. So let's get a little bit more into tillage. And when I first presented this back in 2007, 2008, this wasn't met very kindly. I became known as the anti-no-till guy. I'm not anti-no-till. I'm just pro-science. What does the information tell me about a change in production or a change in the management strategy, and what are the unintended consequences of that change? So this was a study published in 2004. I'm not going to be able to dive into all of the details of this, but just recognize this was actually was fertilizer, but it was commercial fertilizer and manure at 2 different rates. Okay, so TSP, which nobody can find locally here in the state of Ohio, versus a low rate of manure and a high rate of manure. They did a runoff, and I believe this was done with a rainfall simulator at 1 month post application and then 6 months post application. And we have the surface applied in the black filled in bar, and then we have incorporated with a chisel plow or injected. So the incorporation with chisel occurred on the control and the TSP, and the 2 manure rates were injected below the soil surface. So surface applied and incorporated. If you look at dissolved reactive phosphorus, what do you notice about regardless of what the form of fertilizer supplied was, what do you notice about the amount of DRP coming off of that field? Dramatically higher than if it was incorporated. Okay. Now, again, the trade-off is if I'm doing some sort of a tillage and I have decreased risk of particulate pre-transport, that should be reflected in total P. Now, again, don't assume that this is always going to be conserved across all experiments where we do these studies, because I did something very similar to this, which I'm not reporting in this study, that the total P lost was very similar between the 2 different systems, but the dissolved reactive phosphorus was dramatically higher. So my total P lost was the same, but I had a higher percentage of the total P that lost in a dissolved reactive form that was 100% bioavailable the day it hit a water body. Okay, so again, I'm a little bit cautious to share this, because you may leap to the conclusion, oh, everybody should be doing tillage. I don't know that's the conclusion. I don't know that that's the conclusion you should reach, because and I'll show you some other data here in a moment, where there are times when the total P from tillage is actually going to exceed somewhat dramatically the total P from where I have a no-till production system. Okay. But just recognize, boy, this dissolved reactive phosphorus fraction, man, if I'm putting that on the soil surface and I'm not incorporating it, that represents a pretty significant risk of transport of that material that represents some ecological impact once it hits a water body. This is a different study. So that was out of Illinois. This is a study from Iowa, actually done by Dan Kaiser, who's now at University of Minnesota. Again, incorporation of manure versus a surface application. So again, in my tiny head, manure is fertilizer. So I don't differentiate the two. A little bit different here. We have a high manure versus a low manure in a no-till production environment. We have a high manure versus a low manure in a tilled environment. Now the tillage done was disc harrow at 3 locations. There was another location where they used a chisel plow, and there were 4 locations where they're using some sort of a rotary tiller. Okay. I'm not going to look at this data. I'm going to share this as a percentage of total P supplied that was lost. And this sort of falls in line with a lot of the data that's published. The amount that's ultimately lost isn't all that dramatic. So that's part of the challenge we face in production agriculture is if this were, say, 30% loss, there would be a lot of economic incentive to dramatically change the way we supply phosphorus into this production environment to be much more efficient. But if I'm saying you're only losing 2.5%, that's within the calibration of most of your application equipment. So you're not terribly worried about a 2.5% loss agronomically and economically. Environmentally, this represents a problem. Okay. So from this high manure no-till, low manure no-till, if I'm surface supplying it and not incorporating it, the percentage of phosphorus that I'm losing in the total P is about 2.5%. You compare that to the high manure and the low manure where I'm tilling it. So we're talking about a 5x difference in the amount that's ultimately lost. Look at the DRP. So that's going to be this blue bar, about 1.5% for both systems. If I'm tilling it, if I'm incorporating it, the percentage loss is relatively low. My bioavailable P fraction, which is going to be a combination of DRP and total P, is approaching 2%, just south of 2%. And if I'm incorporating it with tillage, it's a much lower concentration. And I do see we have a question. And Michelle, I will address that question as we get towards the end. Oh, and every time I click on that, I lose my control of my screen. There we go. And I want that to go away. And maybe it won't. So what other tillage law? And again, this is just another example. This is from Kansas. Now, this is cumulative load over 2 years. So I've got a chisel versus no-till versus ridge till. I've got a broadcast application. I've got a check, which is the untreated control. And then I have a knife. I've got soluble P on this particular slide or this particular figure, total P on this particular figure. And what do you notice is if I broadcast apply it and I incorporate it, my soluble P load is dramatically lower than if I broadcast apply it and I don't incorporate it, whether that's in a no-till system or in a ridge till system. So the ridge till, there is going to be some level of tillage, but the amount of the surface area of the soil that's actually going to experience tillage is going to be relatively low. But what do you notice if I incorporate it with a knife? If I knife it in, you can't tell much of a difference between any of these systems. Okay, maybe a little bit of a benefit from running the chisel plow as well, but from a soluble P, the primary thing is I've got to get that material below the soil surface some way, somehow, to mitigate the risk of dissolved reactive phosphorus soluble P transport. Total P transport, here again is where that one sort of made me nervous about showing you that the total P was dramatically lower if I did tillage. This is more in line with what you typically see. There's not much of a difference in the total P transport between these different systems. The exception might be the ridge till. I don't know that that's not necessarily have a great explanation for that. I'd also have to look back and see if these were statistically significant. Forgive me, I'm not providing you all the statistics in the data presentation today. But again, total P, there's a trade-off. If I dramatically decrease dissolved reactive P by doing some sort of a tillage event, I'm likely going to be dramatically increasing the particulate P fraction by introducing that tillage. And the question becomes, which one are you trying to? And the question becomes, which one are you trying to manage? And that's where we're going to make our conclusion this morning with our presentation. This is becoming more and more of a discussion point, and that is the cover crop effects. So if you recall earlier, I was talking about no-till, and as a part of that, use of cover crops will dramatically increase infiltration rate, so you'll get less runoff volume. Is that true? So anytime you see a blue square, that is going to be a scenario where the no cover crop actually had a higher value than the cover crop. Anytime it's red, it's the opposite. So you can't always assume, and anything that doesn't have a square around it means that there was no statistical difference. So does cover cropping dramatically increase infiltration? We could question, well, how long has this been in no-till? How long has this been in a cover crop system? Fair question. But at least from the data that's being collected right now within these, evaluating these different production systems, cover cropping doesn't necessarily dramatically change the runoff volume coming off of the field. Now, it does dramatically change the material being carried away with that runoff water, but it doesn't necessarily change the volume of water coming off the field. That's the one thing that I often hear mentioned about no-till and cover crops is, well, you'll just lose less water from the production environment. Well, that's not necessarily what we're finding experimentally. Again, there may be some truth to that longer term, but at least in these shorter term experiments that are being conducted, that's not what we're observing. Stay tuned for the longer term information to guide us to more clarity on this issue. I'm not going to talk about runoff intensity. I'm not going to talk about runoff duration. All I really want to now discuss is the total runoff volume were very similar. But again, what do you notice about the difference between where I don't have cover and where I do have cover? I can dramatically decrease erosion. This isn't anything new, right? We knew this back in the late 80s, early 90s when everybody was really jumping on this no-till bandwagon. And part of the motivation for it was decreasing soil loss. And it does that very, very well. So if I include a cover crop into that system, I can even improve the ability for that soil to stay in place as a function of decreased erosion loss of the soil associated with high rainfall or high intensity rainfall events. Okay, so cover crops do a really good job of helping us decrease erosion losses of soil from our production fields. But now let's dig into a little bit more specific, the particulate P fraction and that dissolved reactive P fraction. And again, remember, anytime you see a blue bar or the blue square, that means that the no cover is exceeding the cover crop. Okay, so the particulate P, this shouldn't surprise anybody. When I have no cover compared to a cover crop, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 times out of the, I want to say this is approaching about 20 observations, about half the time, where I have the cover crop decreases particulate P transport. That's falling right in line with this slide, basically saying the same thing. There was one observation, and we're always going to have one-offs. There was one observation where that was not necessarily true. Now, again, there's going to be some of these that look like they're differences, but statistically, they're similar. And this is another study that was actually, it's still ongoing. It was being conducted in Kansas. So let's look at dissolved phosphorus. So for particulate P, having a cover crop, great. It's doing what we suspect it should do, which is decreasing particulate P transport. But what does it do for dissolved P transport? So now I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14 observations out of about those 20. It's actually not quite 20, but it's close. 13 to 14 of those observations where having the cover crop actually increased dissolved reactive phosphorus transport over the 3 years of this study, again, which is ongoing. So which one am I going to be trying to manage for? Dissolved P or sediment bound particulate P? So total P, it looks like it's a wash, right? Again, 1, 2, 3, 4 times the no cover or the cover crop decreased the concentration of total P, and 1, 2, 3, 4 times it increased it. So for total P, it's about a wash. So again, which fraction is of greater concern? There are other reasons we adopt no-till, which I've sort of alluded to earlier on in the presentation, and it's because we want to capture more carbon, right? We want to build organic matter in our soils. The challenge from a scientific perspective is there's always a trade-off. And is this what is contributing to what we're seeing in the Western Lake Erie Basin, specifically with this increased dissolved reactive P transport and larger algal bloom, more intense algal blooms occurring in that water body? And so here's the concluding slide. And this is why I say that the challenge of managing phosphorus transport, it is not simple. Tillage can help us mitigate risk of dissolved P transport, right? And I think there's sufficient evidence that's been collected to date. And you couldn't have said this a decade and a half ago, to be honest with you, but there's been a lot of individuals that have been collecting more of that data to identify what is the impact of tillage on dissolved P transport. So tillage can help us with dissolved P transport, but that typically translates into higher particulate P transport. It's going to be characterized by some sort of a tillage event, which is going to be decreasing our residue, which is not going to be capturing as much carbon. And it potentially could have more phosphorus being transported in the sediment bound fraction. No-till is the exact opposite. So the question becomes, which one is of greater concern? And the one thing that I didn't mention in this, and I think is an opportunity for us in production agriculture, albeit a challenging one, is are there different management strategies that we could think about to supply phosphorus into that production system to mitigate the risk of surface transport? And I'm thinking specifically of some sort of a system where I'm supplying that phosphorus below the soil surface, so it's not going to be subjected to that surface runoff event. And then tillage really is sort of secondary in that system. That could be easily adopted or moved into a no-till production environment. We have some ideas on how to do that. That's not the nature of the conversation today. Today was just more informative about the two different fractions of phosphorus and how we're attempting in the challenge of managing them both simultaneously. Because I tend to think that part of what we're finding in Western Lake Erie Basin is driven by increased adoption of conservation tillage systems for a lot of good reasons that's contributing to this dissolved P transport that's causing problems in the Western Lake Erie Basin. And with that, I will make an attempt to answer these questions. How much of the total P loss would be dissolved reactive P? Slide 33. I don't know if I can speak to the future water quality impact, because the good thing about particulate P when it makes its way to a water body. Now, it just got really complicated, Michelle. You asked a really complicated question. So once it makes its way to a water body, and I see Jerry, I can't believe Jerry's on this call. When you see what's going on in Western Lake Erie Basin, so let's say I have sediment transport into Maumee, it dumps right where it moves out of the mouth of the river into the open water of the lake. As that is being distributed through that water column, making its way to the bottom, because eventually it will settle out. Once it's at the bottom, the mechanisms are such, specifically if it's an aluminum phosphate, aluminosilicate, aluminum hydroxide phosphate, you're not going to see much phosphorus released from that material. That's not necessarily true of iron because of redox potential. But what can happen longer term is we get resuspension. This is another thing that we think may be contributing to Western Lake Erie Basin with regard to algal bloom is resuspension of the sediment. And now we're going to see some more desorption. I'm not an aquatic specialist that works in that system, so I don't even know if I've seen that published as to what percentage of that, once it's redistributed or resuspended, how much will leave. I don't know if the kinetics change all that dramatically over time. My suspicion is that they do, but I don't hold me to that. So how much of the total P loss would be dissolved reactive P? It's still fairly small. That's what's so frustrating. So the total P loss may be rather significant. So look at the concentrations. I'm going to use this one as an example. So this is going to be in part per million. So the total P in runoff, let's just say it's somewhere around 1.5 part per million. If you look at the dissolved reactive fraction, these are actually fairly high. These are higher than I would have expected. The particulate Ps, so they're about, it almost looks like, Michelle, a 50-50 dissolved reactive P to particulate P. And then there was another question by Jerry. How much P do you lose in snow? Yeah, Jerry, I know some of those studies. I have used some of that data in the past. I don't know that I'd have to pull those up. There's several studies that are published on that, actually. There's a couple from Western or Eastern Canada. I think there was one from Ohio as well. I don't know how much of the P is lost, but if you're familiar with that we have, at least in the Western Lake Erie Basin in Northwest Ohio, we're not allowed to spread any fertilizer at all on frozen snow-covered ground. Now, that doesn't mean that if there was an application event in the fall that didn't get didn't get that nice little rainfall event that would have incorporated at least enough to mitigate the risk, how much potential transport for that material would be. But I do know for if, and again, I'm basing this on recollection, snow melt of a fertilizer application on frozen ground is significant. It's fairly significant in the actual amount of phosphorus that's ultimately lost from that field. Again, when I say significant, it's not going to be 30%, but it might be on the magnitude of 3 to 5% of the total P that would be lost. But again, I'd have to pull up those. I didn't embed those in these presentations. And part of the reason I don't do that is because we're not allowed to do that in the state anymore. So I don't really I'm concerned with it, but I don't really consider it too much anymore. Your second part of that question is an interesting one. If P was spread in the fall and left on top and field cultivated, oh, okay, so this is very specific. I don't know. There's a lot of things that would have to be known by me to understand what your loss potential would have been based upon rainfall events. And that's another thing that I didn't show here. It was sort of, I've got 2 minutes. Hold on, let me go back. I'm going to go back to Dan's work, or no, I'm not even going to attempt that last name, this work. So there is a timing component to this, right? And there's other individuals that have found this. So if you get a light rainfall event, and then I get subsequent heavier rainfall events, and this speaks specifically to your question, your loss potential may be fairly low. That's why it's hard for me to answer that question. But if you didn't get any rainfall events and then I get snow and then I get snow melt, well, then your amount lost could be fairly substantial. Okay. So while that seems like a really simple question, as is often the case, it really isn't. And I apologize for the poor answer. Jake, so why the increase in dissolved P with cover crops? It has everything to do with our inability to incorporate that fertilizer material into the soil surface. That's what's driving it. Simply put, that's what's driving increased dissolved reactive phosphorus transport. So if you look at things like this, this is the dissolved reactive P. It's simply driven by our inability. Oh no, in this particular one, we have the no cover versus the cover, and now I can't remember if they did any tillage with the no cover. Jake, you asked a question that I was not prepared to answer. There's actually a line of thought, and you also sort of have to look at when these events are occurring. So this is in July, later May. These aren't necessarily times, specifically in eastern Kansas, where you would expect to see a lot of phosphorus transport. There's at least a line of thinking that maybe the cover crop residue, as it's breaking down, is contributing some of this phosphorus. I don't know that I have sound evidence of that at this point, but that's at least, Jake, maybe something that would contribute to why we do see this increased dissolved reactive phosphorus associated with the inclusion of a cover crop into that production system. Knowing what I know about the breakdown of the residue of these materials, and I can't even remember what Nathan's ultimately using as his cover crop in that system. I'm pretty sure it's a grass, but I cannot remember what specific grass it is. The breakdown rate of those are relatively slow. It also depends upon when you're terminating the stand, right? If you're doing this well before reproductive growth, the residue breakdown will be much more rapid than if it's going to have a much larger seed-in ratio as it's approaching reproductive growth. So I don't know that I have a clear reason why the cover crops were resulting in a higher concentration. Brad, and this is my last question. I'm a minute over. Has there been a change in pH over time? That is something that has been proposed by a couple of different individuals. I don't know that explains everything. They have pointed to decreases in sulfur contribution or the acidity of the rainfall hitting the soil. Does that change phosphorus speciation in the soil that can maybe contribute to greater phosphorus transport? I don't know that that's the driving factor. Is a contributing factor potentially? Do we have a full understanding of that? Not to my knowledge, based upon the presentations that I've seen here recently. But again, stay tuned. There might be some answers from that. And then the ultimate question, because it becomes, even if this is occurring, how do we change our management strategy at the field scale to mitigate transport? If this is occurring, does that change what we need to be doing at the field scale? And I'm not sure that that is true. Any consideration for form? Yeah, I didn't dive into that. There is another presentation or another data set that gets into form. Does it matter? And it turns out it might. But again, I don't have that data off the top of my head and ready to answer those questions, Mark. But I appreciate the interaction. I apologize for my inability to answer. You guys asked the hardest questions ever, which is typically the case. I apologize for the hiccup. I apologize for going over. I hope you found this of interest. I hope you enjoy the remainder of your winter. I suspect everybody's now in the full grips of what winter typically looks like here in the United States. February doesn't look like it's going to be warm. It certainly looks like it's going to be dry out west. I hope that isn't the case. I hope everyone has a productive cropping season, and hopefully we'll have some good prices waiting on us at harvest time. I appreciate your time and attention this morning. Take care, everyone.